I think we're suffering from the lack of imagination, the lack of social imagination, both about what that Trump administration could really look like. And on the other hand, the lack of imagination about what, Biden and a commitment to democracy and to a better America could look like, and where those, if you will, competing visions of the future are fueling people's commitment and actions.
In a minute, I'll introduce you properly. I'm sitting in Massachusetts, just north of Boston, where my wife, Jeannie, and I have lived for the last 43 years in the same house. And I have 3 of my 5 grandchildren live across the street. So I do childcare. I do this podcast, and then I go pick up a gorgeous 9-year-old little granddaughter at school, and then we spend the rest of the afternoon together.
Well, I admire your stability, and I admire your commitment to your family. Those are 2 beautiful things.
Yeah. I mean, maybe they're admirable, but just selfishly speaking, I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing. So, people always ask me, because I'm 71 now, how is that? And then they hear I'm doing childcare. Oh, they hear I'm doing childcare, and they're saying, oh, your daughter-in-law and son are so lucky. And I'm looking at them like they're crazy. Like, you think there's anything in the striving world career that I give a shit about compared to this?
Well, I'm going to guess that if we talked 20 years ago, you might have said something different.
I would have, but then that is what happens when you begin to forget the people you talked to yesterday, but you gain in wisdom, you're hoping. So I know more about life.
One hopes, as we've discovered, at least in our public sphere, there's lots of people where age doesn't actually lead to greater wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, you hope for that moment when you're losing your marbles, but it overlaps with great wisdom, that you're given a tiny window of opportunity. And then, of course, that all goes away as you lose your marbles completely. So I'm in that transitional mode right now. Anyway.
Well, enjoy your marbles as long as they last. I think that's the goal, right?
I'm going to try to. So let me introduce you properly, which is going to be a really tough thing to do, by the way, everybody, because when you read Steven Beschloss' bio, I guess it's long and it is accomplished. And so we'll try our best. My name is Frank Schaeffer. This is a live Facebook event that then becomes a podcast and goes to all sorts of places, called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Steven Beschloss. And Steven is an award-winning writer, editor, journalist, filmmaker, and content strategist, and happens to be someone nominated for a Pulitzer. And pat myself on the back here, our second guest who's been nominated for a Pulitzer within the last month, which is cool. So we're touching the mountaintops here. He's a professor of practice with a joint appointment from the College of Global Futures and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. He is the author of Adrift, Charting Our Course Back to a Great Nation, and is someone who, all joking aside, when you read everything he's done, which we're going to try to dig into a little bit today, is, and I'm not joking here, but if you were based on the work of yours I've read, Steven, and the articles that I follow you writing, if I was putting together a list of someone that I would recommend if I was the Heritage Foundation type manipulator to the next democratic sane president, I would say, if you're looking for someone to come into the White House and advise you, this would be, someone that I'd put at the top of the list. I think you're a wise and well-read and reasoned person. And I have been parsing again a lot of different articles that I've read by you. So I don't know how you react to all that. Do you want to just talk a little bit, so I don't have to read this long bio, and talk a little bit about your life on a personal side? I know you have kids and you're married, and I know that you have a variety of interests, and then we'll get into some of the content that I'd like to ask you about.
Sure. Yeah. Surely what you've started with is plenty, and I'm most appreciative of the kind words. I would say, at least if I were thinking about the last 7 years, if there's one thing I've been trying to do, is to provide a little bit of sanity and reason to try to make sense in a world that seems increasingly crazy. And, I made a decision some years back, dare I say around 2017, as much as I've always taken as a responsibility to be, and still do, to be fact-based and grounded in reality as much as I could, and to be, I would say, historically, journalistically detached, be more kind of news-minded, to try to be as neutral as I can, sort of given the traditions of journalism. And what I increasingly came to understand was that given what was going on in the White House, it was increasingly important to say exactly what I was thinking and feeling, and exactly, at least my sense of what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, what's normal and what's just, nuts. And what I discovered was that there were an awful lot of people who, were struggling with the same, and frankly, who really appreciated that I was articulating a lot of what they were feeling. And so, the work that I'm doing now is really a manifestation of, what I did at that point, dare I say, in what used to be Twitter, and, sort of the ability to kind of build an audience and build a relationship really with, with a lot of people on a daily basis, and really tap into what was going on in the country. And I was, shall I say, dumb enough to think that on January 20th, 2021, when Trump was evicted and Biden took over, that just maybe, the world would go back to it was never going to go back to normal, but it was going to go to a version of reality that would make sense. And well, we've all seen what's happened in the last 3 years that's that's made that trajectory tough. So I just sort of put that out as a first thing, which, with all the work that I'm doing, which is to try to, in essence, advocate for democracy, focus on the climate crisis, which I think are the two greatest existential threats facing us. And I've tried to focus my work as much as possible on trying to address those in whatever way I can, with a really specific notion that there's not one way that people learn, read, watch, listen, that it is really important to try to work in as many different storytelling formats as possible, because those are all, different opportunities, different ways to connect with audiences and with people who are also trying to make sense of things.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's exciting is that you have found a voice talking about the demise of Twitter as a place where one could have rational discussions without bumping into insane people.
Yeah, that feels like a long time ago, but
but
it was that.
I'm someone that follows you closely on Substack, and you have a Steven Beschloss Substack that I think is so interesting, and I just want to urge people to follow you on Substack and to do what they need to get on that list, because it's something that I follow carefully. And let me go down through a couple things you've written about recently, just headings and subheadings, all of which I've read, by the way, and enjoyed. The continuing struggle for truth, Chris Christie, Trump melts down, blah, blah, blah. Sacred cause of democracy, President Biden takes the case to Valley Forge. How has the January 6th attack affected you? Threats, lies, and continuing impact of January 6th on the matter of cruelty, kindness, and idiots. Why does democracy matter to you? Donald Trump is a criminal defendant. Kindness is still a show of strength. The funny thing is, as I look down through this stuff, there is no small talk in your work and no chit chat. And I don't take you, because I've seen interviews with you, as an over-serious person, but I would just say you're someone who sees things clearly for the seriousness of the moment. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that if you and I had been having this conversation in a cafe in Berlin in 1933, we would have been discussing much the same topics, whether it's kindness and cruelty or the despotism on the horizon. I'm very troubled by the fact that
combined with the indifference that exists among the populace in far too great quantity.
Yeah, and this weird symbiotic relationship between our tech bros and a certain billionaire class, a kind of libertarian individualism that plays into Donald Trump's, I mean, I'm not going to call them strengths, but who he is.
Right.
There's so many similarities between that era and our own that, you know, I take it as a big warning on the wall, as it were. Let's start just by talking about right now with what has happened with Donald Trump reemerging in my neck of the woods that I come from as someone who is got the vote sewed up, it appears, of about 70% of people who identify themselves as evangelicals. And of that 70%, and we can talk about this now, polls and studies are beginning to show that a lot of these people aren't church-going evangelicals. They're simply using the label as shorthand for right-wing MAGA. That's how far it's gone. I come from that background. In the 70s and 80s, my father was very influential in those circles, and I have since left that. But I don't think most people, looking for a way to start our conversation, understand the radical shift from the religious right in which Dad and I and people like us were outsiders in the day, knocking on the door of Ronald Reagan and the Bush family. And my parents used to stay in the Ford White House because we were friends with that family. But nevertheless, we were outside agitators. We weren't in the Oval Office with our hands on the president's shoulder getting our pictures taken, nor were nor were one of us radical Reconstructionist evangelical Christians, the Speaker of the House, you know, where Mike Johnson is right now. So just start there in the shift of evangelicals to not only the inside track, but the total takeover of the Republican Party with our litmus test, and then the devolution of the evangelical movement into a Trump cult, which is now the spearhead of American fascism. And it's really, I'm 71. I've seen it. I was a fly on the wall through the whole thing. We were part of this. I'm still not able to process it because it's so far from anything I could have imagined 30 years ago.
Well, that's a lot. I would say to you that the desire for power within the, you know, Christian evangelical movement has been something going on for decades. You know, we can go back to somebody like Jerry Falwell, as an exemplar of that desire. But I think what Trump has succeeded in doing is tapping into the sense of grievance, and I think maybe more than anything else, this idea of persecution, political, in his case, you know, so-called political persecution. You know, there's nobody who presents himself as more victimized and persecuted, and uses every legitimate effort of the court systems or the judicial department to pursue the application of the rule of law. But then it gets sort of twisted and turned around as an act of persecution against him. And, you know, the tradition, and I've talked to people who are far more knowledgeable about sort of the, you know, the history of Christian evangelicalism, you know, who will talk about, you know, going back a very long time, this history of being a persecuted population within the larger whole. And, you know, it's for many of us, it's a funny thing, sort of given how much, in fact, position and power and presence that white Christians, in fact, do have in America. But somehow he's succeeded at sort of tapping into that mentality. And, you know, that seems to lead to strip away all the other things, you know, all the immorality and amorality that defines who he is. We can, you know, spend the hour making a list of all those elements. But you know, if you take the, you know, the exit polls from New Hampshire, I think there was in excess of 70% support for Trump from the evangelicals in New Hampshire. And we're going to see that for sure around the country. I mean, in the New Hampshire primary, you know, you had 70 of the Republicans, self-identified Republicans, you had 75% who said that, actually it was 74% who said that they supported Trump. right? 25% who supported Haley. And, if you look at, and I sort of paid attention to the exit polls, among those who supported Trump, they defined the economy, I'm going to give you a percentage. They defined the economy, 89% said the economy is poor among those who voted for Trump. 80% who were voting for Trump said they were angry about the direction of the country. Let's just sort of use those two bullet points as an example. Angry, sense of the country's going in the wrong direction, a sense of grievance, that's what he's tapped into. And it's, if you flip it around, for me, it's quite fascinating that what you saw from the voters for Haley, I think they're kind of a stand-in for Biden, really, because, and a lot of them are, in fact, sort of Democrats or independents, who voted in the Republican primary. But, 81% that said economic conditions are good. 76% said they were satisfied about the way things are going in the country. Right. That doesn't sound like, a Republican or surely a member of the Trump cult. And that's the
front. If you read the front page of the Wall Street Journal on any given day, editorial page aside, but the news, of course, the actual facts, as in so many things with the Trump cult, are completely in the other direction in terms of the direction of the economy, the soft landing, and not just the stock market, but consumer confidence, inflation beginning to come down and so forth. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just
no, not at all. I mean, I think that what we're getting at is the sort of how he's tapped into a population who again said kind of overwhelmingly that they think that Donald Trump is the one who's going to fight for them. And talk about a con. I mean, he's convinced people against all fact. Sure. That he's really in it for them, not for himself. And all signs point to that. But he's also been able to, the grievance includes the demagoguery of having the right populations, the people of color, the vulnerable populations, as scapegoats for why is my life not going well? Why is the economy not going well? Why is America seem to be excluding me? Why am I feeling powerless and underappreciated? Well, it must be them.
Let me go through a couple things that first of all, just reintroduce you. You're talking with me. I'm Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest is Steven Beschloss. And to use a kind of a European term, you are, I think, the quintessential public intellectual, if I could put it that way, and a political commentator as well. I want to go to worst case stuff a little bit. Let's just take it as a given that we understand who Trump is, that, this is basically Trump University all the way down, if you want to put it that way, in terms of character.
Yeah.
It seems to me, as someone who grew up in Europe and went to schools in England, et cetera, have a little bit of an eye on the international climate, that when you have the ex-British Secretary of Defense, the equivalent of Secretary of Defense, the head of the British Army, the one, not this one, but the last one, saying that the UK need to gear up for a potential war with Russia based on the fact that he's looking ahead to a potential Trump presidency where we drop out of NATO. Let me put it really mildly. Something's going on. So for a minute, let's just talk about the ramifications of a second Trump term as you see it. You, Steven Beschloss, not just out there, but how do you see this? Because whether it's NATO or what happens to Ukraine or our alliances across the world or Taiwan or our own country's democracy, freedom of speech as we understand it, when this vengeful little guy takes over again, if he does, how do you see it shaking out in the big picture across the board, taken as read who he is?
Yeah, well, we've seen over and over and over. Let's go back to 2018 when he betrayed America in Helsinki and stood by Putin and said that he believes Putin over 17 U.S. intelligence agencies. He gave us an up close and personal example on the stage there with Putin, that his alliances go there. And we've seen in recent days and weeks, I mean, he's been touting the brilliance and the viciousness of people like Viktor Orban and Xi in China and Kim Jong-un. I mean, he's made it clear that those are the people that he admires. Those are the strong men that represent the kind of leadership that he admires. And this is part and parcel of somebody who has no. We've seen it obviously for a long time. I mean, there's no commitment to democracy, surely not to the peaceful transfer of power, and surely not to free and fair elections. He's already talking about the next elections are likely to be, we're in still in January, and he's already talking about that the coming election is going to be rigged. Which sounds like a setup for whatever happens, assuming he's the nominee, which seems like it's inevitable. This is where we're going to end up, that it will not be accepted, and he'll do what he can to tap into his population of aggrieved people to try to create bedlam of one sort or another. But if we went back, and I'm going to go back to your point about 1930s Germany. I mean, I think over the time of his presidency, I really hesitated, talking about Hitler, talking about Nazi Germany, trying to make the connections, because I think once you go into that space, it's hard to pull back, and it's it's a very powerful, dangerous place to go if it's not true, right? If it's not sure. And I think what's happened in the last, let's just say the last year, he's made it clear that what he's after is a dictatorship. What he's after is ultimate power, immunity, impunity, and to use a presidency for retribution. I mean, he's made that absolutely clear. And he's, it's not just this one guy who we can talk about how competent or not competent he is, but now there's a whole network of right-wing organizations like the Heritage Foundation and this Project 25 and Agenda 47 and this whole collection of people who are building an infrastructure which is based on these ideas that have been, they're not hiding it. They've been extremely open, rounding up millions of migrants, deporting them without due process, ending an independent judiciary, ending a nonpartisan civil service, hiring loyalists and demanding fealty, demanding, a presidential administrations with total immunity, which allows him to do anything, right up to shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue if he feels like it. These are hysterical imaginings by people on the left. These have been articulated by Trump and his enablers. And so, I think in my view, we're in a dangerous place, not just because of that. And I think most people, I continue to believe most people do support democracy and don't want that future. But I think we're suffering from the lack of imagination, the lack of social imagination, both about what that Trump administration could really look like. And on the other hand, the lack of imagination about what, Biden and a commitment to democracy and to a better America could look like, and where those, if you will, competing visions of the future are fueling people's commitment and actions.
Well, and also combined with two things, which I'd like you to address. One is that in addition to everything you've just said, this character with his MAGA forces is also on a no-holds-barred quest to stay out of prison.
Right.
And therefore, his, attempt to re-enter the White House is unusual in a sense that when you think, okay, how far would someone go? In normal circumstances, there are no limits to what Trump would do for himself.
Right.
Add into that his only his only final recourse to not have to pay, not just for the January 6th insurrection, but for a lifetime of con artist malfeasance, which is catching up. 29 credible accusations of molestation, one accusation of rape. You know, how do you even begin on this? So that's one point. He's also trying to stay out of prison, which then ups his game in a kind of a desperate mobster type of last attempt. And then the second thing is, the flip side of that is that, in my humble opinion, having paid close attention to politics now since the late 1960s, and been very involved myself with a number of presidencies, including a number of Republican presidents I knew personally, Joe Biden is not just any other president. Given the hand he was dealt, what he has done with our economy and what he has done globally, I'm sorry, I rate him as probably the best president of my lifetime. I wasn't alive during the FDR. So my mind explodes because the left of the Democratic Party does not recognize whom we have in Joe Biden, and they want something sexier, younger, cuter, funner, if I can use a stupid word. And then on the right, they don't seem to be calculating in at all the desperate measures this despot tin pot little guy called Donald Trump. Tyrant. Further
the malignant
sociopath.
There are so many ways to articulate who and what he is.
But it's not even, it isn't a political contest anymore. It is like a kind of comic book, you know, Iron Man versus some monster situation. Do you want to go there a little bit just on Joe Biden and what he's done?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do want to say, I think part of, you know, what you're articulating is the need for you know, the media, for journalists, for all of us to make sure that, you know, our friends and our neighbors and you know, all of those who might vote, our family members, that this isn't a normal election. There is a guy who's interested in immunity and impunity and retribution. That's what that's about first and foremost. And excuse me. And what you know, what the alternative is, it's, you know, this is not a normal political horse race, you know, but what you have is, to your point, we have a very clear picture of a president who, you know, I mean, he came in with high joblessness, you know, by the way, with still in the midst of a very deadly pandemic. You know, how quickly he got, you know, vaccines and arms, right? I mean, it already began to turn that around. And both at the level of, you know, giving people immunization and creating the economic conditions for people, you know, more or less to be able to ride that period economically. But, you know, then he, you know, he started a whole set of decision making that has gotten money into, you know, into lower and middle class people's pockets and communities. You know, we're still at just the beginning of seeing what the Infrastructure Investment Act, all those billions of dollars, which obviously the Republicans oppose, but which are now being spread around the country, which are helping many, you know, many red states and Republican districts, but who are having the effect of vitalizing and energizing the economy of those communities. And, you know, literally in the last day, you had the Bureau of Economic Analysis saying inflation had dropped to 1.7%. Annualized, and you know, the economy of the United States, both in terms of growth and in terms of declining inflation at this point, makes the U.S. the strongest sort of economy, industrialized, advanced economy in the world right now. So it's a, you know, it's a remarkable record, and you know, we still have this very old trope that the Republicans are somehow better for the economy.
Yeah.
But it's the economics are always tricky to talk to people, and I don't know about in your neighborhood, but I am seeing the gas prices are coming down, and
Definitely,
there's going to be a lingering effect of the risen prices for quite a while still. But I think we're in January. I think we have some time for that to play itself out too.
One thing that's going on, and I'd like you to address, just moving on, is this issue in question. And that is, in addition to just, it goes on to the point where I'm sort of laughing in a dark, sad way.
Yeah.
In addition to all this, Trump has such a hold over the quote unquote Republican establishment that now they are working with him to torpedo things that President Biden is doing, whether it's trying to do something on our border, whether it's funding Ukraine, to the point where the Republican Party, under the tutelage of Trump's leadership, is now trying to undermine our country openly.
Right.
They're
Right.
not even pretending not to. Basically, they want to undermine the economy and our standing in the world so that they can turn around and have Trump save us from what they create.
Right. Well,
And I just think this is the worst. I've never seen this before. I've seen dirty politics before, but not this on a national level, torpedoing our own national interests openly for political ends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, Biden said yesterday that Trump has been openly hoping that the economy crashes while he's still president.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, who does that serve? There's only one person that serves, and likewise, it was apparently the Senate was on a good course in trying to put together some kind of a bill that combined dealing with immigration and the border problem and Ukraine, I guess, and funding for Israel, and that was moving forward. And Trump communicated with Mike Johnson and others that he wants that to stop, because he wants the immigration problem to be something that he can use when he gets into office.
Yeah, and to get into office, to point to having made sure that there's no solution at a time when, God forbid, a Democratic president might get the thank you from the American public, and they're trying to torpedo that. I just want to reintroduce you. This is Steven Beschloss, a public intellectual who, by the way, along with Professor Marcy A. Hamilton, Steven is our second guest this season who has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. That's what you are on right now or listening to. And subscribe to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, Frank Schaeffer commentary at substack.com. And we are going to link to everything Steven does and beg you to subscribe, follow, listen, pay attention, because this is the public intellectual who I think, in my humble opinion, gives us the most consistent and best analysis, period, of anybody. If I had to pick one person to just read to figure out what's going on, Steven, it would be you. And I mean that. I followed you.
That's very kind.
And I really mean it. So first of all, just thank you so much for everything you do on that front. Let me change gears a little bit and talk about another aspect of what we're looking at. We've been talking about Trump. We're talking about the Biden presidency. It seems to me that we suffer on the Democratic side from a naivete in the left that does not understand that we do not have time for anything right now until the 2024 election happens, except the big strokes issues that you deal with again and again and again. And whether it is something laudable, like sensitivity toward pronouns, and Lord knows I'm laudably engaged in that, or whether it is third-party candidates who are attracting votes from Democrats because somehow Biden's not whatever enough, whether it's Palestinian issues or the environment, or whether it is just the trivialization of national discourse where we're sort of all Netflixed and HBO'd to death, sound the alarm, because as far as I'm concerned right now, our house is burning down. We're looking at the possessions we're going to salvage. And if we don't call the fire department and do something about this, we're going to lose the whole shitload. Nobody's going to care less. I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic here, but when the Christian white nationalists get their way and we have a theocracy and we really are once again under the Levitical biblical mandate that Mike Johnson would like to see replace our
would.
Constitution. You know,
Nothing like
drag
18th
queen
century
story
values.
time, drag queen story time won't be the issue. The issue will be people will be swinging under highway bridges, hung and lynched by this mob. And I'm not kidding. Sorry.
I don't disagree with you. Again, retribution. Well, I've said maybe hyperbolically, is it possible we'll be seeing public executions? I don't dismiss that as outside of the realm of possibility. The American carnage, we heard that already in 2017, that was the goal. We've seen somebody who's relishing of violence is pretty clear and extreme, and so far we haven't seen it happen on a mass scale as much as we've seen stochastic terrorism, those kind of random acts that have been incited in the minds of sick people and people who are convinced that Donald Trump is the second coming.
But we did see a young man who had shot down 2 people in cold blood at a demonstration, invited to Mar-a-Lago, and made a hero on Fox News.
Right.
A young white
that's
man
the
with
thing.
guns, and that comes very close to what you're talking about for real, because, okay, any crazy person can do a school shooting, but then if you're invited to the former president's residence,
right,
there's
a real upside. Violence and cruelty has a real upside, and and again, that's why you kindly sort of talk about that. I'm focusing on the big picture, and I'm doing it because I really do feel like the threats are existential for democracy, and the big issues. Are we going to be a cruel and violent and ugly, hateful society, or are we going to be a kind and compassionate society that's interested in trying to be more inclusive and to try to create a better world that provides opportunity wherever you exist and whatever color you are? I mean, these are pretty fundamental things, and look, they've been playing out for a very long time in American history, but they're at a kind of a seismic moment, I think, now. And so in some ways getting into the detail, and I think it makes sense to pay attention to what's going on day to day, but in some ways getting into too much of the detail of the normal rhythms of a political season or governance, for that matter, sometimes misses the larger points. And the larger points have never been more vivid as calling us about what kind of world we want to live in.
It seems to me that one of the geniuses of the Biden presidency, that again, a lot of my left-wing liberal friends, I am a left-wing liberal, but my left-wing liberal friends seem to have turned a blind eye to for a long time, is that there's no use talking about, for instance, gay rights or trans rights if you were leaving behind a huge angry section of the population. And Biden has done what Democrats always did, back to FDR, and said, okay, social change and the social agenda is good, but with jobs going overseas, let's do something for families. Let's do something for children. Continuing what Obama did with Obamacare, let's do something about medical care. If we don't bring people with us, some embittered, jerk, lying person will come along and will play the authoritarian cards on that anger. And I've got to say, to that extent, we kind of got what we wished for, because we did send the jobs overseas. We've left behind an enormous white, right-wing, uneducated population that got angry, and now they have
got angry, and we're struggling to make ends meet and survive.
Yeah, exactly. And our quote unquote mainstream media, woke up mighty late to talking to them rather than running wedding announcements on the latest society wedding with nice photographs, if you want to put it that way. And where have we been? And then the other thing I want to mention, just as someone who came out of the evangelical background, is that I've been talking about what the evangelical right has been to this country for a very long time. And until recently, this kind of story never made it into the pages of the New York Times, rarely into the Washington Post. The New Yorker, wasn't going to look at this. The fact of the matter is, it's not like the evangelical movement went to the right with Trump. This culture war, spearheaded by people like the Heritage, and the Federalist Society. This has been 50 years in preparation. These people were groomed to be in place when, come the day we have someone in power.
Right.
The lists were already made to be whispered into Trump's ear as a deal to get him the votes. You know, why were we, the liberal, the Democrats, so asleep at the switch in terms of just what was percolating under the surface that's now on the front page of every newspaper every day of the week?
Right, right. Well, again, you know, was there an awareness of grievance? I would say that there was. What was there a shift that happened? Maybe it's the Clinton years sort of forward, where the Democratic Party began to lose touch with populations, and I'm thinking, you know, white working class people who were increasingly no longer seeing the Democratic Party as the place for them. You know, that's a misfortune combined with, you know, what happened under the Reagan years sort of forward. I mean, a remarkable ability to get people to vote against their own economic best interests. And, you know, we learned, George H.W. Bush learned that lesson, you know, when he essentially played the race card and talked about what a Michael Dukakis administration was going to be. It was going to be, you know, letting out the, you know, the Willie Hortons of the world, and your world is going to become more dangerous and more violent. And, you know, do you really want to let that that happen? And so, you know, I think that I during the Obama administration, the level of vitriol towards him and towards his leadership, I underestimated, and I probably refused to believe that it was so fundamentally about the fact that he was a black man. But I've learned my lesson. You know, I've come to understand that how powerful that impulse is, and how it's been exploited over and over again. So I think we're you know, weirdly, I mean, this goes back, it goes back to the history, you know, the beginnings of the country. It goes back to the failures of Reconstruction. It goes back to the civil rights movement, and, you know, the remarkable moment of having a black president, and the anger that still exists that happened, and you know, the belief that somehow is the end of the white majority and their opportunity to, you know, to rule this country and the world. And so I think the forces that are playing out are not simply American. I think they're global. I mean, these same messages are happening, you know, the Viktor Orbáns of the world. You know, they're being said over and over about, you know, the need for white rule and nationalism as a way to push back the, you know, the dark hordes.
And of course, it isn't just even white nationalism, because you've got Hindu nationalism on the rise in India. You know, the Saudis are still doing what they're doing. Iran claims to be the true representative of Islam, but it's all a radicalization in the name of some sort of politically manipulated theocracy. And, you know, the West Bank settlers have had their turn at this as well in ways. I don't think, again, that a lot of Americans who perhaps don't pay much attention to what's going on out there somewhere understand that we're being given a kind of historical human choice to either go forward into an era striving for multicultural fairness and equilibrium, or essentially hit the 1930s again, do a replay, and go back to a time that would be hard to say when that is. I mean, is it the 14th century? Is it pre-Enlightenment and Renaissance? What is it? So let me switch gears again with you, because I really want to hear what you have to say on this. And these are not rhetorical questions. I so admire the way your brain works. It seems to me that one of the throw the baby out with the bathwater things that our side has done, and I always feel that if you want to get anything done, you have to look at the weaknesses in your own camp. Justifiably so, there's been a concentration on race, gender, and so forth. My last guest on here was Keith Boykin, who's just written this book, Why Does Everything Have to Be About Race? And I love his book, and it has to always be about race because, hey, this is a real deal. We can't just get past it. That said, it seems to me that especially younger people I talk to, seem to have a problem understanding that all we've got that gives us our sense of rights anyway came out of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And yes, I'm sorry, these were old white guys, some of whom, like Jefferson, were slaveholders and awful.
Right.
But we're on this planet.
Yeah,
and where would you rather
we're
be?
interested, however much they, the vision was and the execution was flawed. We're interested in self-governance, and
Right.
we're creating the foundations for the idea of moving beyond monarchy and and really putting in place a version, maybe the best we've had of what we the people actually can be.
Yeah, and the fact that some of them were hypocrites doesn't take away from the aspiration that we can borrow from them and say, too bad they never lived according to what they believed or preached to others. But could you talk about the fact that right now, in my estimation anyway, we haven't come up with any better ideas, that if you want a multicultural society and it isn't based on egalitarian principles that came out of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, hey, the Medici were tyrants in their own way, but they did back Galileo against the church. Voltaire and the French Enlightenment philosophers were a bunch of hypocrites. And some of them, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, were, excuse the French, assholes.
Right.
But that said, this is what we got. And so if it's all basically, now we can't even talk about anybody except in terms of oppressed and oppressor, and we're the oppressors. And so I don't see
in that climate, we're all guilty, right? I mean,
yeah, how are we going to build a new world based on throwing away all the best ideas from the past just because some of those people were hypocrites, or most of them were, but they're still good ideas? What else have we got? I made a little speech here, but I want your reaction.
Yeah, well, look, the history of colonialism is a real thing. You can go back to the papal bull that was enacted just before Christopher Columbus, or right around the time that Christopher Columbus came to the New World. Well, we talk about his discovery of the New World. In fact, the papal bull gave him and others the opportunity to plunder the New World, right? To go and get everything you can for the benefit of Spain and the colonial powers. So I mean, that's there's a reason why Christopher Columbus is in many circles maybe less of a hero than he used to be. But look, it isn't hard to look at a history of America that is about the genocide of Native Americans and the implementation of slavery as a system to build an economy and build the country, and the people who signed the Declaration of Independence who were involved in all that. I mean, that is the history of the country that we all have to acknowledge. But what's also true is that that the effort to try to create a better world, to bend the arc of history towards justice, I think that's been real. I mean, the formation of the Department of Justice happened, right during Reconstruction under Ulysses S. Grant, and specifically because of the rise of the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan that was doing what they could to murder the emergence of Black leaders and to intimidate, scare, Black voters from participating in the democratic process. So, these issues have been playing out for a very long time, but, whether that's our history or not doesn't mean you sort of turn away from it. I mean, we have a problem with a lot of young people who are increasingly doubtful about the value of democracy. And that's not just, in the last 5 or 10 years, that's been going on for decades, the sort of waning power of democracy's narrative to motivate people to believe that this is the form of government that's going to give them a better life. So as that's waned, it's created the environment for autocrats and let's just say all the sort of anti-democratic authoritarian types to offer a different picture that sounds like, I alone can fix it. We can take care of the problem in Ukraine in a day. All of the suggestions that our complex, uncertain, overwhelming world can be fixed by this authoritarian move is something that does find some welcoming ears, even in amongst the anti-colonialists, because they doubt that democracy is the path forward. So we're living, in that sense, I think, in a very volatile time, which I think makes the work that you do and the work that I do and all of us who are trying to advocate for a progressive and positive future, and it just makes in my view, the work so necessary.
Yeah, and I'm always somewhat frustrated by talking sometimes to younger people. And by the way, they've plenty of older people as well who came in the 60s, who seem to have this idea that unless we find perfection somewhere, that something is illegitimate. And also a kind of a blindness about history. If you want to talk colonization, let's go to the 7th century and look at the whole of the invasion of the whole North African continent in one direction by Islamic armies who converted by the sword, and then the Ottoman Empire that got up to the gates of Vienna. But that also was what we're talking about. Let's talk about Indian Hindu nationalism now that sends off an assassination squad to Canada to kill a Sikh. Let's talk about what happened in Africa itself between various tribal factions, and let's talk about Southeast Asia. Let's talk about what China means to the world right now. My point is not to make myself or yourself or our country look better by comparison. It's just to say once in a while to people, my point of view is, let's check out the actual state of the human race through history, and then be glad for those points of light we do have. Case in point, and I don't think he'll mind, my very dear and close and best friend, Ernie, who produces this show, is a gay married man to rock. They just celebrated their 20th anniversary. These are fragile new freedoms, and Rock and Ernie in Saudi Arabia would be beheaded. Okay, so that's a little reality check.
Right.
That's the world we're in. I'm glad that I'm in a country where I can fight for their right to be married and not worry that they will be killed by the state. And when Mike Johnson wants us all to go back to the book of Leviticus and throw away the Constitution, I take it personally, because Ernie's my friend. Let's get real here a second and be glad for what came out of the Enlightenment and what came out of the very imperfect colonial wicked West, because this is all we've got. So, I get very upset because we're looking at something that will make everything that a lot of people who don't like our colonial past, it will make that past not only small by comparison of the authoritarian totalitarianism we could become, but it seems to have no sense of the moment we're in, that if you care about these things, all hands on deck. This is the moment, 2024.
Right. Well, and by the way, I would say that's democracy. And I think I said it at the beginning, it's also the climate crisis. And, I pay a lot of attention to it. I write about it. I think about it. I'm doing what I can. And, the history of that is an interesting one, exactly because, it forces a kind of shift in the look at, just say, the last couple of 100 years. I'm somebody, I grew up around Chicago, and I witnessed and lived in around Pittsburgh for some years, and I witnessed sort of the fruits of the Industrial Revolution in terms of great industry that built the modern world and the world that we live in. Skyscrapers and automobiles and all of the things that define our world depended upon what happened during the Industrial Revolution. And it's exactly that same period of time that separated people from the natural world and led them to not pay attention to what the consequences were of growing carbon emissions that has led now to the same thing that built our world, maybe the same thing that kills our world.
Yeah.
It's sort of suddenly the Industrial Revolution and all of its remarkable achievements look a little bit different.
Yes.
Did we actually go down a wrong path a long time ago? That doesn't lead me to say, like, I wish we didn't have the modern world. It makes me look at the world we have now and say, is there a way to do things differently? And I want to say one more thing about the sort of the climate change movement. There were years where that was very much focused on this question of, do people believe that climate change is real or not? It doesn't really, that question doesn't really matter anymore, because my point of view is that whether you believe it or not, your house may burn down in a wildfire too. Your house may wash away in a flood too. Your world may change whether or not you believe it. And so, in some ways, I think it is a parallel for the conversation about democracy. Whether you think our house is on fire or not, your house may end up burning down too. And that's why I think the work right now is so much about being able to expand people's capacity to as much as sort of know what's happening now every day, but to be able to think wisely, to think openly, to be more vivid about what the future may be, and let that vision, both in terms of what could be better and what could be terribly worse, let that influence the choices that we're making now.
Yeah, that's a good segue to something I just wanted to emphasize again. I'm talking with Steven Beschloss, who I admire greatly, and he writes the extremely popular America, America, which can be found at america.substack.com. And I would really encourage you to subscribe. There are a lot of choices out there online, and you have to look at your time and use it wisely. But if you want to go through 2024 and beyond with your head screwed on right, with some good ideas, original thinking, but also just a very deep knowledge of history and how things work, and a grounded, sensible voice, please subscribe to America, America, which can be found at america.substack.com, because Steven has a unique and powerful voice, and you need to hear it and use it, and please share it with people. So please, if I'm talking to an author of a book, and where I can hold the book up, but if metaphorically I'm holding this up and saying, please subscribe, everybody. It's really important. Yeah, I really mean it.
Can I say, one of the things that when I started this, and I'm almost at a 3-year anniversary next month, which was sort of the month after the insurrection, that was the time when this started, and I've published close to 600 essays in the last 3 years. I think the total is 578 or something like that. Not that I pay attention, but what excites me more than anything isn't my publishing all this work, is that the community is built. And it's a pretty thoughtful, compassionate community that they respond to what I write, but they talk to each other too, and I get a lot out of the dialogue that happens amongst the community. And so sometimes I hear from people who say, oh, well, you're just talking to progressive communities, and it's talking to the choir, and to a point that might be true, but here's how I look at it. We're at a time when we need choirs that are singing beautifully, that are committed and motivated, and are ready to do the hard work to ensure that democracy survives. And so, I think there's no downside on strengthening the voice of the choir.
Yeah, and what I appreciate so much about your work, just to go a step further, is that I know this sounds like it's obvious, but it's fact-based and backed up.
Thank you.
And we're swimming in that
These things matter.
Yeah, we're swimming in that netherworld of messiness out here in the online stratosphere. I so appreciate the fact that your work is all like a chapter out of a well-researched book. I mean, that's the only way I can put it. So thank you so much. I've spoken to David Frum of The Atlantic recently, and Gerard Baker, who was the Wall Street Journal editor and also the editor of the Financial Times, and Tim Alberta and Keith Boykin, and I've asked them all this question.
That's an impressive parade of people.
Yeah, well, we've had good discussions. I've so enjoyed, as I put it to Jeannie, my wife, the other day, I said, I'm so grateful for the fact that I get to talk to people I'm actually interested and admire anyway for something. And I don't only talk to people who I happen to agree with you. I can't think of anything you've written where I'm saying, oh, I take a different view, but you're the exception. Usually I disagree with someone. But I wanted to ask you, what is the role of media in an age of information overload? Because we are both working in that. And when I say overload, I mean just all this crap, and there are no gatekeepers. So again, what do you see as the role of media in an age of overload? And and we're trying to build a community as well within Conversation with Frank Schaeffer and my podcast. It has to be said, and also now we have a book club. It has to be read. We're doing what we can. Tell the truth and share the truth. But again, what is the role in media in this age of media overload, and how do you see your role in that?
Yeah, well, I think it's changed. I mean, if there was a time that it was the sort of traditions of journalism that were very much about sort of neutrality and seeing the expression of truth by offering two sides to every issue.
Yeah,
we've reached a point where it's quite clear that there are at least two sides to every issue, but sometimes, one side is right and one side is wrong. And that's one thing if it's a minor thing. It's quite another thing if it's about, acceptance of America or the dissolution therein of America. And so, I think the more fundamental role that journalists have is to tell the truth.
Yeah.
That you don't have to ask two people if it's raining outside. You go to the window and you look, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to go ask, is the house on fire? You go and see it for yourself. So there are truths to be found, and I think it's in these times, it's a responsibility to articulate that. And, it does lead me to focus on the big picture as much as I can, because I think the big issues are the ones that do need to motivate the choices that people make, and to help people make sense of a world that can feel increasingly uncertain and overwhelming and overly complex, to just sort of find a way to be able to articulate it, to frame it so that it's more navigable. So I do think that journalists have that kind of responsibility. I think in this very particular moment, the most important thing is that when I read stories by political journalists, and they're treating the time that we're in as a political horse race between two political candidates, and the likely two political candidates, I'm continuously upset and offended by it, because one is a criminal defendant with 91 felony charges who is plotting a fascist dictatorship, and another one who accepts democracy and advocates for it and believes in the rule of law and the sacred tradition of the peaceful transfer of power, and enabling every citizen to have the right to vote, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a responsibility to talk about that in as explicit and a vivid and frankly continuous way, with every story, not to get lost in the routines of how these kind of political stories typically historically get covered. This is not that time anymore.
Yeah, this is not an entertaining horse race.
Yeah. It's I tend to say this isn't a political story this year. This is a crime story.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a brilliant way to put it. Let me thank you, Steven, for having been here with me. I urge people again to subscribe to your Substack, America, and I'm really grateful that you took the time. I love your public persona. I love the voice you bring to matters. And if anybody cares what I think, if you're going to follow somebody and you're choosing between Steven or me, follow Steven. So thank you. I appreciate the time.
Follow us both.
Okay, follow us both. And again, one last time, thank you so much for sticking with the big themes and keeping our eyes focused on them. That's so important, because what you said about this horse race aspect is so discouraging. I feel exactly the same. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk with you.
Me too.